Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Cadence Independent Media Production. Today, we are talking about an extremely important topic, and it's actually a fact. Your snare wire tension dominates the sound of your snare drum, and we need to pay attention to that. We spend a lot of time in the mid-range of tuning on the show here, getting a really good sound that works for a lot of different things, but today we are going in extremes. We're going to go super low tuning and super high tuning and figure out just how to manage snare wire tension, not just to get a good sound, but to figure out what variations there are there that could be the defining factor in the behavior of the drum overall. Now today we are using what we have here, pretty run-of-the-mill drum, chrome over brass, 6.5 by 14. It's a really middle-of-the-road sounding drum, but what it does have is a very large tuning range, which is going to allow us to go super-duper low and figure out what works down there, and then go all the way in the other direction to nearly as tight as it'll go and find usable sounds there across the spectrum of the wire tension. In the interest of the longevity of the heads on this drum today, we're going to start with the very low tuning and work our way back up to the super high. Let's hear this tuning and then we'll talk about it. Now, if you're listening to this and it sounds alarming, you're right. There's a lot going on in the sound of a snare tuned this low, especially with no muffling to speak of anywhere on the drum. The fact of the matter is that when we hear really low, really beefy, really fat snare sounds, what we are hearing is a long note. And depending on the muffling that you use, the nature of your drum, the heads and all of that, the overtones and the fundamental, all those parts of the sound are going to sound different for you. We're explicitly going with wide open today rather than trying to dial this part of the sound in because we need to focus on the snare wires, and as we add things to the drum, it can get a little bit in the way of being able to hear exactly what the wires are doing to our sound. When we tune low, everything slows down. The heads are moving slower, the sound is moving slower, the wires are moving slower, and we need to understand and really be in a smart mindset about how to make adjustments to this so that they can interact effectively and not add to the raspiness or possibly get us into a choked kind of sound. What this means at a low tuning is that there's a relatively narrow swath of tensions for the wires that are going to both give us good snare response and not choke the drum out, as the heads are quite slack at this point and very little tension from the wires can start to stop the resonance of the heads and destroy that big beautiful note that we're making. When we strike a drum at any tension, but it's very, very clear at this tension, we are vibrating the batter head, which is in turn vibrating the snare side head, which is in turn vibrating the snare wires. Now at this point, the wires and the snare side head are fighting each other a little bit. They're pushing and pulling, and that's what's giving us the interaction with the wires and adding to that length of note to give us that beautiful decay that we're looking for at this range. This does mean, however, as I said earlier, that if they are too tight, then that head down there can actually move and you don't get that sustain because the wires themselves are literally choking out the resonance of the snare side head. We have some previous episodes that delve deep into this topic and all of the crazy stuff that can happen when you are inadvertently choking out some part of your snare drum, and you should definitely go check those out if you haven't already. Now what we want to do is demonstrate moving through nearly no tension on the wires up to the point of actually choking the drum out and hear the progression of those sounds as we move through that tension. At this tension, in addition to the wires possibly choking the drum out and giving us part of the sustain that we need, there's also the possibility of choking the drum out by literally hitting it too hard. So if you're experimenting at this kind of tension on the heads, make sure that you yourself are not also choking the drum out by smashing it. Let's swing the pendulum all the way to the other end and go super duper high. For this demonstration, we have pitched up the batter head and the snare side, but we are leaving the tension of the wires the same as where we ended up with our optimal sound in the low tuning. This sounds great. This is still usable for rolls. They sound a little bit loose, but if we want to do buzzes, that's what we're looking for anyhow. And this again is the same tension on the wires. We didn't change it at all. We just raised the pitches on the heads. Now, the flip side is that, generally speaking, at least when I'm tuning high, I'm looking for articulation, and we don't have a whole lot of that going on right now, especially if we're not playing rim shots, because it's getting lost in all of that decay in the wires. When it comes to high tuning, we're after a shorter note. We're after articulation, generally speaking, and we're also after something that is loud and going to project that articulation over a greater distance. This means that now we need to experiment with tightening up the wires a little bit and find a nice sweet spot where we have a breathy, good sound when we hit rim shots, articulation in the center, and not so much air in the wires. Let's add a little bit of tension to these wires and hear how that sounds. Depending on the snare mechanism that you have on your drum, your results will vary depending on how much resolution there is per turn. We were doing about a half a turn for each of these adjustments and getting a pretty dramatic result after each. If you're utilizing the plastic strips that come along with a lot of snare wires that there are out there to buy, and you run into the phenomena of releasing your snare wires, hitting your drum really hard, and hearing the wires jump up and slap the bottom head, this drives us crazy. This is another reason not to use these plastic straps. They don't allow the wires to relax away from the drum. And if, like us, you like to play your snare with the wires off sometimes, it's a definite no-go. We generally use cord here for just about everything because it gets us the best result and also affords a little bit more usable resolution in the wires because there's a little bit of a stretch to the cable. It works for us really, really well. You can also use cloth straps, but we really need to get away from any kind of plastic here because we need a little bit of stretch in there for the drum to be able to breathe, especially if we're going to do tighter tensioning on the wires. We chose today, for the sake of demonstration, to decide to go a little bit past the point of no return with these wire tensions and choke out the drum on purpose at this high tension. There's a couple of reasons that you might want to do this. For us, one side of it is that there are a fair amount of old recording sounds where the drums were just choked. So if we want to get that sound the way that they did back then, we have to do it. The other side of it is that we are called a lot in modern music to emulate electronic or deeply affected recorded sounds with an acoustic drum, and many of those sounds are very, very short, very, very articulate, and gated, just really crushed in the computer or a drum machine. So this could be another time that it might be worth seeing what happens when you really ratchet them down. Let's hear how this intentionally choked out sound sounds. I actually had a ton of fun with this. We were going back and forth with different things to try out on it that reminded us of records we'd heard and things like that. And as much as we talk about choking a drum out being a bad thing, if it gets you the sound you need, then it doesn't matter what it takes to get that sound, as long as you're not damaging anything, and we are not damaging anything here. This is just very tight wires on a very tightly tuned drum. And for what it's worth, also take into account that this is a 6.5 by 14 chrome over brass. This is a rock drum, and it does this too. So whatever you have, do find the extremes, do experiment, do look for the things outside of what you imagine that drum is for. Since we're talking about choking out our snare drum, something that's worth noting that we were discussing today is that at the low end of the tuning spectrum, the way that choking happens from a player perspective is actually inverse from a high tuning. When the drum is tuned super low and very slack, the harder you hit it, the more likely you are to overextend what that drum can do. You're crushing it with energy. It can't deal with all of that power, and the sound simply gets choked. It's happened to me. It's probably happened to all of us at one time or another. On the other hand, at a very, very high tuning, we experience the choking at low dynamics, where there isn't enough resonance and movement in the heads and the wires for us to play articulate, clean things with tone, because the tone has been crushed out by the wires. At the same time, at that high tuning, we can hit it really, really hard and it sounds really, really good. So all of these things become a tool as you make choices about tuning, tension, snare wire tension as well, so that we can get what we need at whatever range it is. Whenever you're sound checking, whenever you're figuring out your sound check with your highest dynamic, your loudest playing, but set your snare wires to be good for the quietest thing you have to do on that gig. A lot of the gigs that I play are either all super loud or largely very quiet, and I make these choices every day in those moments to make sure that as I move through the show, I have what I need out of the drum. And if it's smashing all night, I can kind of just set it and forget it and not worry about it too much, but we do need to plan for these things so that we can have the best possible night. Thanks for checking this out with us today. We were really excited to share this with you. And if you'd like to hear more, head over to the Patreon. The link is below. Lots of extra content over there, cymbal series, all kinds of stuff. It's a great way to help us continue to make the show here. It's a great way to support the community. And finally, please like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell below, and tell us your very high or very low tuning stories, specifically with what you had to do with the wires, because there's a lot of wiggle room there, and we were surprised even today.